On the afternoon of 10th of February 1918, in a windowless garrison hall on the Polish frontier, the head of the Soviet delegation rose to address the German diplomats and generals across the table. He was tall, lean, dark-bearded, in a worn black overcoat. He had arrived in Brest-Litovsk a month earlier as the new People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the 7-week-old Bolshevik government of Russia. His name was Lev Trotsky. He spoke briefly. The Bolshevik government, he announced, considered the war ended. Russia would not sign the treaty the Central Powers had laid before it. Russia would not continue to fight either. Russia was simply leaving. The German delegation could draw its own conclusions. The phrase he used became famous. In Russian, ni mira, ni vojny, no peace, no war. The Germans were stunned. General Max Hoffmann, the chief of the German negotiating team, had been demanding for 6 weeks that Russia recognize the independence of Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Kars on terms favorable to German occupation. He had been told by Berlin that Russia would sign because Russia had no army left to refuse. Now the head of the Russian delegation had refused without refusing. Trotsky walked out of the hall. He boarded a train back to Petrograd. He believed his moral and rhetorical victory had been complete. He was wrong. To understand why, one has to understand what Russia had been doing since November. The Bolsheviks had taken power on the 7th of that month. Within a fortnight, Lenin had ordered Russian forces to seek an armistice with the Central Powers. The army was disintegrating. Soldiers were walking home in their thousands. Factories were striking. The Romanov state, deposed 8 months earlier in February, had left the new Soviet government almost no fiscal or military capacity. A separate peace was the only way to consolidate power against the gathering white counter-revolution. Negotiations began on 22 December 1917 in the German-occupied fortress of Brest-Litovsk. The Russian opening position, drafted by Trotsky, was a maximalist counter-proposal: peace without annexations, peace without indemnities, the right of self-determination for all peoples, no transfer of territory under duress. It was a beautiful document. It bore no relation to the actual military balance. The Central Powers negotiators read it politely. Foreign Minister Richard von Kuhlmann replied that Germany agreed in principle, with one small adjustment. The Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, and Finland had already exercised their right of self-determination by declaring independence under German military protection, and so would not be returning to Russia. A small map was produced. Russia would lose, by the Central Powers calculation, about a third of its population and about half of its industry. Trotsky asked for a recess. The recess lasted 12 days. He used it to argue by telegram with the leaders of the Bolshevik Party. There were 3 positions in Petrograd. Lenin's: sign the German terms now, accept the loss of territory, save the revolution. Bukharin's: refuse and turn the war into a revolutionary war of partisans against the Germans. Trotsky's: declare the war over without signing, hold a moral position, wait for the German Revolution that was already brewing in Berlin. Lenin's position lost the vote in the Bolshevik Central Committee. Trotsky's won. That is what brought him back to Brest-Litovsk on the 10th of February to deliver the Ni mira, ni vojny speech and to leave the room. The German response took 8 days. On the 18th of February, German divisions began Operation Faustschlag, in English, punch. They advanced, almost unopposed, through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, sometimes covering 30 miles in a single day along the railway lines. The Russian army, demobilized by Trotsky's own decree, did not exist to resist them. Within a week, German forces were 100 miles from Petrograd, close enough that the Soviet government would soon move the capital to Moscow. On the 23rd of February, Lenin called a vote in the Bolshevik Central Committee on whether to sign the original German terms. He told his colleagues, "You must sign this shameful peace in order to save the world revolution." He threatened to resign and walk away from the government if the vote went against him. He got a majority of 6-3 with 4 abstentions. One of the abstentions was Trotsky. On the 3rd of March 1918, the Russian delegation signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the same garrison hall. Russia ceded Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Finland, and the Caucasian provinces of Kars and Batum. Together, these lands held 34% of the former empire's population, 54% of its industrial capacity, 89% of its coal, and 26% of its railways. The terms were considerably worse than what Russia could have signed in January before Trotsky's Gambit. The treaty lasted 9 months. The November 1918 armistice that ended the First World War contained, as one of its clauses, the abrogation of Brest-Litovsk. Germany lost the war on the Western Front before it could consolidate the gains it had made in the East. By 1922, most of the territory taken from Russia at Brest-Litovsk was back inside the new Soviet Union. But Trotsky's Gambit had not paid off in any of the ways he hoped. He had assumed 3 things. He had assumed that the German army was too exhausted to advance further. He had assumed that the German working class would rise against its government if the war was clearly Berlin's choice. He had assumed that the moral position would eventually prove the practical one. The first turned out to be wrong within a week, the second within a year, and the third never. On the 2nd of May 2026, Iranian state media released a 14-point counter-proposal in response to the United States' offer of a 2-month ceasefire to end what is now its 3rd month of war. Iran's proposal was transmitted through Pakistan, which has emerged during this conflict as the principal back-channel intermediary between Tehran and Washington. The 14 points are maximalist. Iran demands a 30-day end to all hostilities, not a 2-month ceasefire. It demands the withdrawal of American forces from Iran's periphery. It demands an end to the naval blockade of Iranian ports. It demands the release of frozen Iranian assets abroad. It demands the lifting of sanctions. It demands an end to Israeli operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It demands a new multilateral mechanism governing transit through the Strait of Hormuz, replacing the existing US-led arrangement. It demands reparations. President Trump's response was characteristically direct. "I'll review the plan," he said on Saturday. "But I can't imagine that it would be acceptable. The structural play is the same one Trotsky tried to run 108 years ago, almost to the day. A weaker side, having entered negotiations because it lacks the capacity to keep fighting, opens with terms it knows the stronger side will reject. The bet is that the stronger side will be exhausted enough to compromise, that international opinion will sympathize with the moral position, and that domestic political dynamics inside the stronger side will, in time, soften the terms. The Trotsky Gambit has been tried by many weak parties since 1918. Almost none of them have made it work. Brest-Litovsk is taught in foreign policy schools as the canonical case of how a maximalist opening from the weaker side gets you worse terms than the realist opening would have. North Vietnam tried a softer version of it at the Paris talks between 1968 and 1972 and only got a deal once Hanoi had been bombed for 11 days at Christmas. Saddam Hussein tried a hard version of it in the run-up to the 1991 Gulf War and lost his army. Slobodan Milosevic tried it at Rambouillet in 1999 and lost Kosovo. The exception that proves the rule is Hanoi after 1973, which simply waited 2 years for the Americans to leave and then took Saigon. That outcome required a stronger side that had already lost the will to enforce its own terms. Iran cannot count on that. Tehran's leverage in May 2026 is not zero. Iran can still close Hormuz on a sustained basis, even after months of attrition. It can still strike American bases in the Gulf. It can still make life difficult for the Lebanese border, but none of those capacities translate into the diplomatic position Iran is asking for. The choice in front of Tehran is the choice that was in front of Lenin 108 years ago: sign the unacceptable terms now, save the regime, and rebuild over decades, or refuse, prolong the negotiation in the hope of better leverage and risk losing far more than was originally on offer. Lenin won the vote inside the Bolshevik Central Committee in 1918 by threatening to resign. We do not yet know who, if anyone, is making the equivalent argument inside the Iranian leadership. Last time, the Gambit cost Russia a third of its population and half its industry, regained only because the winner of the war lost a different war on the other side of Europe 9 months later. This time, what comes next?